majority of repairs that a jeweler encounters are on rings. In the second tape of the jewelry repair video series, we'll discuss how to size rings down, how to size them up, soldering rings together, as well as repairing some damaged and broken shanks. We'll also talk about how to replace a head in a ring, how to reset a stone, and how to repair prongs with retipping and repronging. And then we'll show you some about repairing damaged illusion or ballerina mountings. Be sure before you get into taking in repair work that you thoroughly understand the take-in procedures of repair work as discussed in the first tape. Some of the most common and easiest repairs are taking a ring up a little bit. Sometimes a customer will bring you a ring that's very badly misshapen, and they actually think that the ring needs to be sized up because it fits so tightly on their finger. By reshaping the ring, it will often fit just right. Because this ring has been so badly abused, the chances are that it's also age-hardened, which means that there's a lot of stress in the metal. Before working on this ring, it will need to be annealed, which is no problem because there aren't any stones in this ring. That will reduce the risk of cracking the shank when you go to straighten it out.
To anneal the ring, first coat it with an antioxidant. This prevents formation of oxides on the metal during heating.
In order to see when your ring gets to the proper temperature for annealing, it's a good idea to turn off the light at your workbench first.
Annealing is necessary to release stresses caused by working the metal and to prevent stress fractures or splitting of old solder joints. Color changes in the metal during annealing are not usually visible under the working light of the bench. Using a soft reducing flame, gently play the flame over the whole piece, heating it evenly until it is a dull red, or about 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. After turning off the torch, quench in water or pickle when the piece loses its color. Quenching keeps the metal in a fine-grained condition.
This next ring is a white gold ring that needs sizing up just a very small amount. I can do this by hammering it on the mandrel, but it needs to be annealed first to make sure that it can stretch. This is particularly important with white gold because of its brittle nature. Be sure when you anneal a white gold piece that you don't quench it after heating it, but rather just let it slowly air cool before proceeding.
As we discussed in Tape 1, before doing any sizing, you should make sure that the numbers on your ring sizers correspond with the numbers marked on the mandrel.
To take this up just a slight amount, I'm going to hammer it down on my mandrel.
If the ring does need sizing and the amount is less than one size, you can generally stretch it by forcing it along the mandrel to the proper size.
Another way to do a slight enlargement of this ring, other than with the ring mandrel, is to use this rolling ring enlarger. It comes with a number of dies that are made to conform to different shapes of ring shanks. Select the proper shape and place it in the ring roller. If you have a ring that needs to be sized up quite a bit, the ring stretching machine is not a good solution. You're better off to add a piece because you don't want to thin the ring down too much. Be sure when you're using this tool to take the ring up gradually so you can check the size as you go, and also to make sure that you uniformly stretch the ring up on both sides around the shank. As you take it up a little bit, as with any sizing, flip the ring over so that you get a uniform stretch to the ring.
If more than a slight stretch is needed, or the ring seems to be age-hardened, it will be necessary to anneal it to soften the metal. For most rings, annealing each time you stretch more than a size is necessary.
Sometimes you'll encounter a customer that either has a large knuckle or has a very top-heavy ring that makes it hard to adjust the size properly. Adding 2 bumps to the inside of the bottom of the shank, such as this ring, is a good solution for either of these problems. Sometimes you'll be called on to make a ring smaller. If the ring doesn't have any stone set in it, this is a pretty simple procedure. First thing you'll want to do is determine if the ring has been sized before, if there's a solder seam that you need to accommodate. This can be done by gently heating the ring to see where the solder seam might have been, though sometimes they are visible without having to heat them. If you're not sure, use the torch to find out.
Remember, a cast ring which has not previously been sized will not have a seam, nor will any seam be apparent if the ring was plated. After you have found the seam, determine the amount of metal to be removed from the ring. Many mandrels not only have ring size markings, but have a scale showing the increment in circumference between sizes. A ruler with these measurements is also available. The difference between sizes is about 2.5 millimeters.
There are ring cutting machines that will remove an exact increment from the ring. However, if you're just doing a few at a time, it's faster to stay at your bench and cut them here.
Making perfectly parallel cuts in a ring shank can be difficult. With this type of saw guide, squared cuts are automatic. Deburr the saw cuts and use ring-bending pliers to close the gap.
I'll be using hard solder on this joint. To determine how much solder to use, I'll look at a cross-section and use about 2/3 of that amount of solder. You can tension hole solder in a ring by sliding the ring down on a mandrel to open the seam slightly and inserting a piece of solder. This reduces the amount of cleanup by not having too much excess solder and also reduces the risk of overheating the solder, causing pits in it.
To prevent oxides from forming, an antioxidant solution, usually boric acid dissolved in alcohol, is painted over the entire surface of the work before soldering. The alcohol is burned off, leaving a frosty boric acid coating over the entire piece. Always work in a well-ventilated area when using alcohol-based solutions. A higher temperature soldering flux is applied to the joint. This will reduce the surface tension of the molten solder, causing it to flow more easily. You should use a slightly softened or reducing flame. You don't want an oxidizing flame which will create oxides on the metal. A flame with a pronounced hiss is an oxidizing flame. Move the flame across the joint so that you bring the metal on either side to the solder melting point at the same time. After the solder flows, quench, pickle, and rinse. After pickling, file and sand the new joint. You can use the flex shaft with a bristle brush to polish the inside. Sand the outside and polish first with Tripoli. If you use finger cots to protect your fingers from the heat, use a separate pair for each buffing compound to avoid contamination of the wheels. Finish off with rouge and clean in the ultrasonic.
Like the other gold band, this ring also needs reducing in size, though not as much as the other one. If you're doing many ring sizings, it's worth investing in a machine such as this, which enlarges rings on the top and reduces rings by compressing them on the bottom. This machine should only be used on plain bands, and definitely don't use it for rings that have stones set in them. Soldering wedding sets together is a job that the jeweler is frequently asked to do. This keeps the rings from turning uncomfortably on the finger and also prevents excessive wear between the two rings. First, you need to be sure that the rings fit well together and make any adjustments if necessary. For this operation, I'll be able to solder the rings together with a medium white gold solder.
If the stone in the ring is a diamond, you can solder with it in place unless it contains a fracture. Rubies, sapphires, and spinels are also heat tolerant, but can be problematic if they've been oiled to conceal flaws. If you are applying solder with a poker, watch for the flux to become glassy before adding the solder. Try not to heat the solder directly. Overheated solder will result in a weak, pitted joint. Keep the flame moving, and remember that solder will flow to the area of the greatest heat. By moving the flame ahead of the solder, you can draw it along the seam.
I need to let these rings air cool before proceeding so I don't shatter the stone that's set in them. Sometimes you'll be called on to solder rings together that really weren't intended to go together and don't match up very well. In these cases, use binding wire to attach the rings together for soldering rather than soldering tweezers.
Common repair which will come into the shop is sizing up. It's important to find the solder seam in the ring if there happen to be an old solder. As you can see, there are two solder seams here on this particular ring. It's important that you remove the piece. I'll be using a saw to remove it by sawing directly on both solder seams. If you leave one of the solder joints in and you put the piece in, what ends up happening is during heating, the piece may slip and then you'll have many problems in finishing up the ring. On a repair, it's real important that you use the same type of material that the ring is made of. If this ring happens to be 14 karat, I'd use some 14 karat stock. There's a federal law in the U.S. that you should use plum gold, or the carat that's stated on the item, if it happens to be 14 karat, 10 karat, or 18 karat, that the piece contains exactly 14 or 18. So plum meaning that it's exactly the amount that it is. The solder as well, which would usually be a plumb solder. The reason why you would want to use a plumb solder is that the color match is very important. You don't want to see the solder seams after the piece has been soldered. When I first start out sawing, I stick my thumbnail right where I want the saw to begin. Then I will push forward on the saw, which will put a little mark right where I need to begin sawing. If you don't do this, what will happen is the saw will skip across the metal and make gouges all over the entire piece. So I want to start the saw cut in that manner. You want these two saw cuts to be parallel to each other. It's very important when you're installing a new piece. This ring is going up approximately 3 sizes, so it's important that you get the correct contour of the ring prior to installing the new piece. It's also important that you turn the ring and hammer it up from both sides so that you don't get a taper on the inside of the ring. Now that the ring is the right size and shape, I'll need to get a piece of stock that's the correct thickness for the new piece that I'm going to install. I'll take a measurement on the ring, which is approximately 1 millimeter thick. I want the new piece to be approximately 1.3 to 1.5 millimeters. It's important to use a larger piece so that you can file the ring down to the correct contour. If you use a piece that's the exact same thickness as the ring, you may run into some problems and make the ring thinner. When a ring comes in for repair, the ring should leave the shop the same thickness as it came in. I have some pre-milled stock that I keep at my bench of different sizes and widths, so I can just pick and choose what I need for the particular job. I'll be using this piece of metal, which is already pre-annealed, and I'll be taking a forming block. I'll use this forming block so I can form the shape of the new shank material. It's important that it has a nice